Well, let me open with just telling you a little bit about an acquaintance of mine I'll refer to as Sarah. Sarah experienced gender dysphoria at a very young age. And gender dysphoria is when your biological sex as male or female and your gender identity, your emotional or psychological experience of yourself as male or female are not in congruence. And it's the distress that's associated with that. So Sarah was born biologically male and experienced this distress. Now, I met Sarah when Sarah was an adult, and Sarah had already transitioned and had used cross-sex hormones and even surgeries. And when I met Sarah, Sarah said to me, as a Christian, she said, I may have sinned in what I did. All I know is at the time, I felt such excruciating distress, and I didn't know what to do. I felt like my life was at stake. And then she turned to me and she said, what would you have me do now? This was a very difficult moment, obviously. So gender identity itself usually forms between ages 2 and 4 years of age. A boy or a girl will be aware of themselves as a boy or a girl. And so gender dysphoria, if it's present, would be present at a very young age in most cases. So someone like Sarah then would be part of what we call a transgender umbrella. Not everybody who's transgender experiences gender dysphoria. In fact, most wouldn't say that they do. There are people there who would say, I'm genderqueer, or I'm gender fluid, or I'm agender. There's different emerging gender identities within that umbrella. And there's not even consensus about who is in and who is out. Some people would include people who cross-dress for more purposes of arousal. Someone like Sarah did not. Most people who cross-dress do not. Others would include people who cross-dress for entertainment purposes. Many people would not include those in this umbrella. People with intersex conditions where it's been difficult to identify them as male or female at birth because of different conditions that could be chromosomal or gonadal. And so someone who's intersex is often considered transsexual. So there's not quite consensus on that, but someone like Sarah would certainly be in the transgender umbrella, experiencing this distress. It's not a very common experience. It's hard to get good estimates. Some of the estimates are based on studies in Europe where people were going to specialty clinics for hormonal treatment or for surgery, and that's not the most common resolution in this area. So it's probably significantly underrepresenting this population. But you'll hear numbers like 1 in 10,000 biological males or 1 in 20 or 30,000 biological females. And that's what's coming from those studies of people in Europe going to specialty clinics. If you just ask people, are you male, female, or transgender in a survey, today you're getting, I've seen 2 national studies like that done. I've seen one that was 1 in 300. One was 1 in 215. So there would be more common to be transgender than someone seeking out hormonal treatment or surgeries, but of course much less common than someone identifying as gay, lesbian, or bisexual. So what does gender dysphoria feel like? I ask people this quite a bit because I work with people in this area, and I am often asked this by people for whom this is not their experience. And one person said to me, it's like puzzle pieces that don't fit together. If you've ever done a jigsaw puzzle and you've tried to kind of force that one piece in, this person, transgender female, said to me, it's like living with that puzzle piece not fitting all the time. Another person said, it's like listening to an old-time radio show where they have that hiss of that in the background, and you can sort of make out the program if you can sort of ignore that hiss, but it does not go away. Another person said it was like dissonance in music, these tones that are discordant, that are seeking resolution and stability, but you never find it. Just to give you a sense for that. And of course, it can be very, very difficult for people, this distress, and it can lead to very high rates of suicide for this population. So I mentioned that in most cases, the onset is in childhood, not in all cases, but in most cases. And it's interesting that in most cases, it resolves on its own by the time that child reaches late adolescence or adulthood. And there's some debate going on about that right now. But it appears that in most cases, maybe 75, 80%, some would even put higher, these cases seem to resolve on their own for reasons we don't fully understand. We're not sure what causes it either. One of the most popular theories today is called the brain sex theory. And the brain sex theory is based on the idea that the brain can script in a direction towards either male or female dispositions and behaviors, and that happens for males and females anyway. And so during fetal development, is it possible that when there's sex differentiation of the genitals in the early stages of development, is it possible that in later stages that the brain could shift in the other direction? And would that cause this to happen? There's a number of things that have to align for gender identity and biological sex to be congruent. So is it possible just over hundreds or thousands of times that there just wouldn't be that alignment over just these variations that would occur? And that's a very popular theory right now. The research to support it is mixed, and there are people who believe that it's more from nurture or environment and rearing. People there usually cite studies of disrupted family relationships, lack of sort of identifying with the same-sex parent, histories of abuse. But those are mostly correlational studies. It's really hard to get a sense of causation from them. But there are some interesting correlations that are worth noting. My own view is that I don't think we know, and I'm prepared to say we really don't understand the causal pathway for gender dysphoria, let alone the transgender umbrella, of which there are many, many different experiences. And I doubt we'll have one theory that will really explain all of that diverse phenomenon. One transgender person shared with me, if you've met one transgender person, you have met one transgender person. There is remarkable diversity within the community. So I mentioned that in most cases it appears to resolve, but when it doesn't resolve, what happens for that older adolescent or now that adult who experiences gender dysphoria? It doesn't tend to resolve then on its own, and there aren't good protocols for intervening to sort of resolve that with the person's biological sex. So people end up, through trial and error, trying out different, what I would call management strategies, trying to manage the gender dysphoria through trial and error. And so I tend to think of these as residing along a continuum. One professional organization describes them as reversible steps, partially irreversible steps, and then irreversible steps. I just think of them as management strategies that reside along a continuum from least invasive to more. And so, for example, you'll have some people, biological male, who might wear his hair longer, or maybe he wears light makeup, and it just takes the edge off of the gender dysphoria. I know a biological female I interviewed, she says, I wear male boxer shorts, and for me it takes the edge off of the dysphoria. Or a woman who might wear a binder or something like that, or prefer a different name or pronoun usage that helps with the dysphoria, right? And then along that continuum, some people might cross-dress intermittently, maybe privately at home or on the weekends. I know people in my area in Virginia who will drive to Washington, D.C. or to Richmond, and they'll cross-dress maybe for the weekend, and it just sort of helps kind of as a release valve for some people. And then along that continuum, some people use like low-dose hormones, not enough to sort of form a cross-gender identity on a full-time basis, but just to kind of take the edge off of that gender dysphoria. And then, of course, there is the use of more cross-sex hormones, and there is the idea of different surgeries that can take many different years to complete. And so on that continuum, there are these different efforts really to manage your experience of dysphoria. And I think the way that you view those management strategies is going to be informed by the lenses through which you see this topic and the people represented by this topic. And I think there's three lenses in play in our culture today: integrity, disability, and diversity. And the integrity lens is the lens that's held by many Christians. And one evangelical theologian described this lens as kind of the idea that there's an essential maleness, an essential femaleness that was intended by God from creation. And they're meant to be brought together, they're complementary and meant to be brought together in a whole. And it's that whole that lays the sort of parameters for what is considered morally permissible or morally impermissible in terms of sexual relationships. And then when you get to the question of cross-gender identity, the concern from this group would be that cross-gender identity in some way goes against the integrity or the sacredness of male-female distinctions. The disability lens is the view that kind of over time, given the number of factors that have to align, there will be times when those factors do not align. And just as that occurs in nature, it is a non-moral reality that is to be addressed with compassion. When Christians are drawn to a disability lens, they might see this lens as a lens that's best explained as a result of the fall. Maybe the idea that there's this lack of congruence that ordinarily aligns, but in some cases doesn't, is a reflection of the fall in some way that we don't fully understand. But this lens draws more compassion and empathy. The third lens is a lens of diversity, and this is the lens that the culture is rapidly moving toward. My field of psychology is there. And so in this lens, the idea is that these differences, these experiences of gender identity and experiencing your gender identity differently than those who experience it along a binary of male and female, that they represent a people group to be celebrated as a culture, a representative of diversity. And I think it can be helpful just to realize that these different lenses are in play, just so that Christians can understand why it is they're not having very constructive conversations with different people, because you're not seeing the conversation through the same lens. You're speaking past one another. In fact, there was a really interesting interview that Barbara Walters did with Jazz several years ago. Jazz was born biologically male. Jazz has transitioned since she was 4 or 5 years of age and presents as female, and now has a reality show. I think now she's a teenager. And years ago, Barbara Walters interviewed Jazz and Jazz's older sister and 2 twin brothers and said to the siblings, "How do you explain Jazz to your friends?" And the older sister said, "Well, I tell them it's a disorder and it's just not something that she chose." And Barbara Walters, who's done a fair bit of reporting, knew what just happened, and she looked at Jazz and said, "Jazz, what's it like for you to hear your sister talk about you that way?" And Jazz says, "Well, I don't like that word, disorder. I prefer special or unique, because I think that's what transgender is." And so right there in a family where you know they love one another, you have an older sister who's relying on a disability lens to explain her sister to her peer group, to pull compassion and empathy from them, to essentially say, "Don't reject Jazz. Please find it in your hearts to love my sister." And Jazz hears that language of disorder and says, "I can't imagine a future where I could thrive when you think about me in that way. I need to think about myself as special or unique." And so she draws on a diversity lens. And you could imagine in a family, maybe parents who come at this from more of an integrity lens, and they could just be speaking past one another while they love one another. And I can tell you that this happens all the time in families. It happens in churches, and it happens in denominations, and it happens across our culture today. We speak past one another, and we don't take time to understand how another person reached the point where this lens was important to them. Most of us just want to shout what our lens is to the exclusion of others. So I know many people, let's just take from the integrity framework, for example, who would shout integrity, integrity, integrity louder and louder. And it's like speaking to someone, if you speak English and they don't, you're just speaking in English louder, hoping that in speaking louder, they will now understand you. You're not speaking the same language. You're coming at this from different explanatory frameworks, different lenses through which you understand gender identity. So, the other reason I think the lenses are helpful is that I think Christians today would benefit from drawing on the best that each lens brings to the discussion. I do think that the integrity lens lays a foundation, a theological foundation that's important for Christians, and it probably matches up pretty well with what Christians think about these issues globally and historically today. But at the same time, I think it fails in areas of compassion and identity. And I think when I look at the disability framework, I see in it greater compassion for the person. The idea that someone is dealing with a condition that's not going to resolve on its own. And so how do you help someone manage dysphoria in the least invasive way possible? And what does it mean to journey with that person and show them empathy and compassion as they try to figure this out? And even from the diversity lens, I do think what Christians have failed to appreciate is that that lens answers fundamental questions about identity and community that all of us would want to understand about ourselves. Who am I, and of what community am I a part? And I think we've failed to appreciate how the diversity lens ends up answering that question for someone navigating gender identity concerns. And you have to look at what the contrast is for many churches trying to speak into identity and community for that same person. So the church today is going to be pastoring and caring for people navigating this terrain, people who are making decisions and wondering, how should I live? And other people like Sarah who are several steps down that path who are saying, what should I do now? What would you have me do? And thinking about the best way to care for one another and to journey with each other. One pastor who contacted me said that a transsexual person like Sarah had contacted him and wanted to get together to talk about the church and whether they could visit and how that would be for the faith community. And the pastor called me and said, I don't even know what to say. They didn't cover this in seminary. I don't know where to begin. And I said, look, take them out for coffee, sit down with them and say to them this: it seems like I'm meeting you at about chapter 7 or 8 of your life, but I haven't had the opportunity to hear about chapters 1 through 6, but I'd like to. And I guarantee you that person has never heard a pastor say something like that to them before. The story of redemption in the life of the believer has many chapters, and we don't know what chapter we're encountering when we meet the next person navigating this terrain. But I think we can commit to helping them know Christ and to grow in a relationship with Christ, and perhaps that relationship down the road will in some way inform decisions in this area. But I don't think that navigating gender identity concerns precludes a person from a life in Christ. And what we can commit to do is to walk with people and to be humble stewards of what we know and what we do not understand. Thank you.